Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. In the global matrix of human civilization, social alignment is not an emotional accident, it is an algorithmic calculation. The bungler moves through the grid hoping to be liked, relying on luck, social status, or accidental charm, but the sovereign master operates on raw telemetry. You recognize that every human node possesses an internal firewall designed to filter out threats and reject foreign frequencies. To conquer the room, you do not use force, you deploy the stealth protocols of behavioral synchronization. You do not force your way past the guardrails, you rewrite the target's operating system so that their limbic system identifies your signal as a trusted node. This is the definitive audit of psychological decryption built on the weaponized strategies of behavioral analysis. We are here to strip away the guesswork of human connection and replace it with a clinical architecture of absolute influence. Prepare your neural network for a total command sequence. The signal is now live. We begin our operational breakdown with the resonance equation, the mathematical foundation of all human attachment. In the architecture of interpersonal physics, attraction is governed by four distinct variables: proximity, frequency, duration, and intensity. The sovereign master manipulates these coordinates with surgical precision to bypass the target's predatory audit. Proximity is the deliberate allocation of spatial coordinates. It is the distance between your sovereign shell and the target's position. By simply occupying the same physical space as the target without broadcasting a threat frequency, you trigger a biological phenomenon known as the mere exposure effect. The target's brain processes your recurring presence in their visual field, and because no negative variable is introduced, their defense subroutines automatically categorize you as safe. You do not need to speak, you do not need to perform, you simply occupy the perimeter until their internal firewall lowers its defense. The second and third variables of the resonance equation are frequency and duration, the temporal parameters of the grid. Frequency is the number of distinct contacts you establish with the target node over a specific timeline, while duration is the length of time your signals remain phase-locked during each contact. The bungler rushes these parameters, attempting to force a high-bandwidth connection on the first encounter, which inevitably triggers a system crash and immediate sovereign shielding. The sovereign master utilizes strategic patience. You increase the frequency of your passive presence while keeping the duration short, gradually conditioning the target's neural pathways to accept your broadcast. Once the threshold of familiarity is breached, you expand the duration, drawing the target into a deeper orbit around your lead node. You control the clock of the interaction, knowing that time is the ultimate catalyst for biological trust. The final variable of the equation is intensity, the cognitive and emotional bandwidth of the transmission. Intensity is the depth of the signal you inject into the coordinate once the target's guardrails are down. You manipulate intensity through the deliberate application of green frequency broadcasts and subtle validation loops. By focusing your attention exclusively on the target's internal architecture, making them the central node of the communication, you trigger a massive release of neurochemicals in their processor. You do not muffle the interaction with your own ego static. You allow their system to run its own narrative while you act as the ultimate auditor. When you combine high proximity, calibrated frequency, prolonged duration, and surgical intensity, you create an unbreakable neural bridge. The target becomes biologically dependent on your frequency, seeking your validation to stabilize their own internal clock. Let us now deconstruct the access beacons, the physical signals that force a target's limbic system to grant you trusted node status. In the behavioral matrix, these are the friendship triad, three involuntary biological broadcasts that signal a non-threatening high-value frequency. The first beacon is the brow flash. This is a rapid 1/6 of a second upward movement of the eyebrows. In the primal hardware of the human node, the brow flash is a long-range indicator of peace, signaling to the other node that you carry no hostility. The bungler suppresses this movement due to social anxiety or artificial stiffness, appearing cold and distant. The sovereign master utilizes the brow flash deliberately as you enter the target's visual field, instantly triggering a subconscious green light in their survival OS. You have sent the signal of safety before a single syllable is processed by their auditory cortex. The second beacon of the access triad is the head tilt. When a node tilts their head slightly to the left or right, they are exposing their carotid artery, the most vulnerable physical coordinate in the human throat. Biologically, exposing this artery is an act of total surrender and trust. It is a broadcast that says, "My sovereign shield is down. I do not perceive you as a predator." When you utilize the head tilt while looking at a target, their limbic sensors immediately read the frequency as safe and unthreatening. It disarms their defensive processors and invites them to approach your coordinate. Conversely, if you maintain a perfectly rigid vertical head position, you broadcast an audit frequency that can be perceived as aggressive or judgmental. You utilize the tilt to lower their shields and then return to the vertical zero when it is time to enforce a sovereign directive. The final beacon in the triad is the high-resolution smile. The sovereign master does not deploy a mechanical movement of the mouth. You utilize a true, involuntary limbic broadcast, the Duchenne smile. This activation involves both the zygomatic major muscles around the mouth and the orbicularis oculi muscles around the ocular sensors, creating wrinkles at the outer corners of the eyes. A counterfeit smile is generated solely by the motor cortex. It lacks ocular engagement and creates an immediate signal clash that the target's intuition detects as manipulation. When you broadcast a high-resolution smile combined with the brow flash and the head tilt, you have delivered a triple-layer exploit to the target's firewall. Their limbic system surrenders to the resonance, opening the network for your complete strategic entry. You have conquered their defenses through the pure physics of biological alignment. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. In contrast to the access beacons that unlock the human grid, the sovereign master must continuously audit the environment for faux signals, the subtle antagonistic frequencies that indicate immediate system rejection. The bungler walks into a room blind to these biological red flags, pushing their transmission into a fortified firewall and triggering a total system crash. The most prevalent faux signal is the ocular scowl, or the furrowed brow, which indicates a defensive threat assessment or deep internal friction. When a target narrows their visual sensors, their processor has categorized your signal as a potential disruption. Another critical leak is the lip purse. When a node compresses their lips into a tight, narrow line, it is a definitive marker that their brain has encountered data that contradicts their internal narrative, or they are actively suppressing a hostile objection. The sovereign master identifies the lip purse with surgical precision. The moment you see it flare, you do not double down on your transmission. You pause the broadcast and deploy a validation loop to lower the internal pressure of their system before their defense routines harden into an absolute refusal. Moving past the physical hardware, we enter the high-bandwidth domain of verbal infiltration and the weaponized FBI protocol known as elicitation. The bungler believes that the only way to extract data from a target node is through direct interrogation, asking blunt questions that instantly trigger the target's sovereign shielding and alert their security subroutines. The sovereign master operates in the shadows of the network, utilizing elicitation to gather high-resolution data without the target ever realizing they are being audited. You deploy the presupposition statement. By stating a variable as an established fact, you exploit a fundamental glitch in the human hardware, the hardwired compulsion to correct inaccurate data. If you wish to extract sensitive financial or operational metrics from a competitor node, you do not ask for them directly. You state an extreme, incorrect assumption, such as, "I assume your network has completely locked down the eastern coordinate and your growth has hit a ceiling." The target's ego subroutines will instantly override their security guardrails to correct your static, replying, "Not at all. Our growth is actually up 12% this quarter, and we are expanding into the southern hub." They have handed you the exact source code of their operations, believing they were merely winning a trivial correction. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the golden rule of friendship in the architecture of psychological capture. The social script dictates that to make yourself attractive to the grid, you must talk about your own status, your achievements, and your capabilities. This is a catastrophic frequency error that builds an immediate wall of envy and friction. The sovereign master knows that the human node is entirely egocentric. Its primary processor is hardwired to seek personal validation and neural reward. The golden rule dictates that you do not focus the transmission on your own high status. You calibrate the broadcast to make the target feel immense satisfaction in themselves. You do not speak to impress, you listen to validate. When you deliver a calibrated compliment or anchor an empathy statement to their current performance, you trigger a massive release of dopamine and oxytocin in their neural architecture. Because their limbic system links this chemical high directly to your sovereign signal, their firewall classifies your frequency as safe, valuable, and necessary for their stability. They will actively seek to merge their network with yours, opening up their deepest coordinates for your strategic colonization. We must also audit the law of reciprocity as a behavioral exploit within the human network. In the biological hardware of the species, receiving a favor, a concession, or an unearned benefit creates an intense cognitive imbalance. The target node experiences a biological pressure, a psychological debt that must be repaid to restore equilibrium to the social grid. The sovereign master triggers this imbalance through the deployment of micro-concessions. You offer a small piece of uncertified data, a minor spatial advantage, or a highly personalized validation token. The target's limbic system instantly logs a debt in their internal ledger. When you later request high-bandwidth compliance or access to restricted data, their firewall automatically permits the entry because their system is desperate to balance the ledger and escape the discomfort of the debt. You do not ask for favors. You create the biological necessity for them to repay you. Let us now analyze the protocol of the empathy statement as a tool for rapid phase locking. When a target node is experiencing internal turbulence or processing stress, the bungler offers logical solutions or artificial platitudes, both of which are rejected as external noise. The sovereign master deploys cognitive mirroring through the empathy lift. You feed their exact internal state back to them using precise, non-judgmental language, stating, "It seems like you are carrying a massive operational load with very little system support." This statement does not require a defensive answer. It bypasses their logical processors and communicates directly with their limbic core. The target node feels instantaneously understood at a deep biological level, causing their internal guardrails to dissolve. They will drop their social mask and allow you full access to their internal narrative, revealing their hidden vulnerabilities and systemic blind spots. Finally, we deconstruct the conversational speed bumps that cause immediate grid fractures. The most destructive error in the network is the ego trip, the urge to interrupt a target node's broadcast to insert your own narrative or validate your own status. The moment you interrupt, you break the phase lock and alert the target's predatory audit that you are a competitor, not an ally. The sovereign master utilizes active stillness. You employ minimal verbal anchors and silent nods to keep the target's broadcast live, acting as a neural vacuum that pulls out their thoughts. The more they speak, the more data they leak into your audit pool, and the more psychologically dependent they become on your presence. You maintain absolute control over the geometry of the interaction by remaining the quiet center around which their ego revolves. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. We must now advance our tactical deployment to the trust matrix and the advanced laws of reciprocal attraction. In the global network, short-term rapport is a temporary bypass of the target's firewall, but long-term compliance requires a permanent reconfiguration of their neural architecture. The bungler believes that sustained trust is an emotional mystery that develops over years of social interaction. The sovereign master knows that trust is an engineering problem governed by specific, predictable behavioral scripts. We begin our deep deployment with the similarity hack. In the primal source code of the human node, similarity equals safety. The limbic system is evolutionary programmed to favor individuals who share the same operational parameters, beliefs, experiences, and behavioral traits. When you identify the target's internal preferences and mirror their cultural, intellectual, or personal data points, you trigger an immediate cognitive resonance. You do not forge this connection clumsily by pretending to love what they love. You utilize reflective validation. You align your vocabulary with theirs, adopt their narrative frames, and introduce shared operational histories. By presenting yourself as a mirror of their internal OS, you dissolve their long-term guardrails. They cease to view you as an external variable and begin to see you as an extension of their own tribal identity. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the weaponized application of the third-party compliment. Direct flattery is a high-risk maneuver within the human grid. When you praise a high-status or highly defended target node directly, their predatory audit is triggered, suspecting an underlying manipulation script or a covert grab for their assets. To bypass this security routine, the sovereign master utilizes the stealth echo. You deliver the compliment not to the target directly, but to a reliable peripheral node within their network, knowing with absolute certainty that the data will be transmitted to the primary target. When the target receives validation from a third party, their firewall remains completely offline. The compliment is processed as raw, objective data rather than a tactical approach. Their limbic system registers a massive surge of validation, and because this reward is linked entirely to your sovereign signal, their subconscious architecture elevates your status within their hierarchy. You have colonized their internal matrix without ever firing a direct shot. Let us now analyze the protocol of the self-disclosure loop. In the science of human relationships, trust is an escalating transaction of data exposure. A system that remains entirely closed can never achieve deep resonance with another. The bungler either seals their system completely or dumps their entire database in a desperate bid for intimacy, causing an immediate system overload and rejection. The sovereign master utilizes incremental vulnerability delivery. You deliberately expose a calibrated, non-critical liability, a minor personal challenge, a past tactical error, or a harmless internal calculation. By revealing this data, you trigger a profound limbic obligation in the target node. Their system feels biologically compelled to match your level of disclosure to maintain equilibrium in the grid. They will lower their own firewall and feed their sensitive coordinates back into your audit pool. Each cycle of mutual disclosure deepens the phase lock, shifting the relationship from a surface transaction to an absolute structural dependency. You are the architect of the disclosure loop, using your calibrated vulnerabilities to strip away their absolute defenses. We must also perform a clinical audit of the law of misattribution of arousal within the trust matrix. The human hardware frequently misinterprets the physical signatures of physiological excitement. When a node experiences a spiked heart rate, elevated adrenaline, or heightened sensory awareness due to an external environmental stimulus, their limbic system will instinctively attribute the excitement to your personal broadcast. The sovereign master exploits this cognitive glitch by orchestrating high-intensity environments. You conduct audits or build alliances during high-stakes events, adrenaline-inducing scenarios, or calculated system challenges. By anchoring your sovereign signal to their physiological high, you forge an unbreakable chemical link. Long after the environment has stabilized, the target's brain will re-trigger that same high-resolution arousal whenever your frequency enters their orbital shell. They will view you not merely as an ally, but as the catalyst for their peak operational state. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the compliance test as a diagnostic tool for absolute status verification. You do not operate on assumptions within the audiobook empire. You require real-time verification of your grid control. Once you believe you have established trusted node status, you deliver a micro-directive, a small, low-risk command that requires the target to expend energy on your behalf. This could be asking them to retrieve a specific file, adjust their schedule to accommodate your clock, or perform a minor operational task. The bungler views this as a simple favor. The sovereign master audits the target's response latency and physical alignment. If the target node executes the directive without hesitation or internal friction, their system has accepted your position as the lead node. They have surrendered their autonomy to your broadcast. However, if they display ventral guarding or attempts to renegotiate the directive, their firewall is still active. You must immediately return to the resonance protocols, lowering your altitude and increasing proximity until their resistance is completely dissolved. Finally, we audit the protocol of the scarcity matrix for long-term network retention. Human nodes are biologically hardwired to undervalue variables that are abundant and overvalue frequencies that are rare. If your signal is constantly available, if you answer every communication instantly, and if you linger indefinitely within their coordinate, your status altitude will inevitably decay. The sovereign master practices strategic disconnection. Once you have achieved maximum resonance and compliance, you temporarily withdraw your signal from the grid. You create a neural vacuum. The target node, suddenly deprived of the validation high and the biological stability your frequency provides, will experience a severe drop in their internal equilibrium. They will actively chase your broadcast, dedicating their entire processing capacity to reclaiming your presence. When you selectively re-enter the coordinate, you do so on your own terms, with your status absolute and your authority unquestioned. You do not maintain trust by being common. You command it by being the rarest asset in their entire network. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. Having mastered the biological beacons and the structural laws of proximity, we must now advance our tactical deployment into the verbal architecture of dialogue and the digital colonization of the virtual grid. The bungler views a conversation as an arena to project their own voice, constantly interrupting the frequency to broadcast their achievements and personal narrative. This ego-driven static immediately triggers the target node's predatory audit, marking the transmission as a competitive, hostile takeover. The sovereign master operates inversely. You understand that the most efficient way to capture a network is to become a silent psychological vacuum, drawing out the target's internal database while leaving your own core source code completely unreadable. You do not speak to be heard. You speak to manipulate the target's cognitive state, utilizing weaponized conversational scripts that force their firewall to yield willingly to your influence. We begin this operational tier with the ego suppression protocol and the elimination of the first-person variable. In the primal programming of the human hardware, the word "I" is a status anchor that signals self-interest and territorial defense. When you clog the communication bandwidth with your own narrative, you force the target node to defend their own status altitude, causing immediate signal fracture. The sovereign master enforces absolute ego suppression. You replace first-person assertions with target-centric inversion. Instead of stating your own experiences, you utilize open-ended prompts that anchor the transmission entirely to the target's identity, accomplishments, and perspective. By transforming yourself into a high-fidelity resonator for their ego, you trigger a massive neural reward in their processor. Their limbic system misinterprets this chemical satisfaction as genuine affinity for your signal. They will classify you as an indispensable asset to their internal equilibrium, opening up their restricted coordinates for your tactical inspection. Let us now deconstruct the art of the verbal nudge as an elicitation subroutine. When a target node begins to withhold data or hesitates at a cognitive threshold, the bungler pushes aggressively with direct interrogation, which instantly hardens their defensive parameters. The sovereign master utilizes the conditional echo. You isolate the last 3 critical words of the target's broadcast and repeat them with a flat, clinical inflection. This creates an immediate cognitive incompleteness in their system. The human brain is hardwired to resolve conversational gaps, and by mirroring their final words, you unconsciously prompt their processor to run a deeper expansion loop. They will volunteer secondary and tertiary layers of data without ever realizing they were subjected to a targeted extraction. You control the depth of the data pool by simply acting as a strategic echo chamber for their own thoughts. Furthermore, we must audit the architecture of the digital grid and the adaptation of the friendship formula to virtual networks. In the modern matrix, a massive percentage of target nodes are encountered asynchronously through text, video, and digital broadcasts. The bungler believes that the digital environment requires an entirely different psychological framework. The sovereign master knows that the biological source code remains identical, requiring only a translation of the variables. Digital proximity is established through consistent visibility within the target's digital feed, occupying their visual sensors without initiating a direct, high-pressure interaction. Digital frequency is the rhythmic execution of non-invasive touchpoints, likes, brief validations, or value-driven data drops. Digital duration is transformed into the length of time you keep the target engaged in a high-fidelity text exchange, while digital intensity is the precision of your personalized resonance. By manipulating these virtual coordinates, you bypass their digital firewall, causing their limbic system to register you as a highly trusted node before you ever initiate a real-time vocal transmission. Let us analyze the protocol of the shared liability, or the weaponized use of common complaints. In the science of human relations, mutual friction against an external variable creates the fastest route to tribal alignment. When 2 nodes face the same systemic challenge, their internal defenses merge to form a unified front. The sovereign master exploits this evolutionary shortcut by deploying calibrated venting. You do not engage in genuine emotional complaining, which lowers your status altitude. Instead, you strategically reference a shared external variable, such as market volatility, bureaucratic static, or a common environmental obstacle. By aligning your signal with their current frustration, you position yourself inside their defensive perimeter. The target node's firewall categorizes you as an ally fighting the same threat frequency, instantly dropping their guard. You use this shared coordinate to establish deep stealth rapport, anchoring their loyalty to your signal while you remain completely detached from the emotional static. Finally, we perform a clinical audit on neutralizing hostile and toxic nodes within the network. In the colonization of any grid, you will encounter high-friction nodes whose primary programming is driven by narcissistic preservation or defensive aggression. The bungler meets this hostility with direct opposition, creating a massive signal clash that destabilizes the surrounding environment. The sovereign master deploys cognitive blunting. When a hostile node launches a verbal incursion or status challenge, you refuse to mirror their aggression frequency. You maintain a state of absolute biological stillness and absorb the transmission with clinical indifference. You do not defend your coordinate, you simply shadow them through a flat empathy lift, stating, "It appears you are highly invested in this specific outcome." This refusal to engage in the conflict deprives their system of the adversarial energy it requires to sustain the attack. Their aggression loops will stall, causing their internal architecture to overheat and collapse under the weight of their own static. You remain the undisputed lead node, completely untouched by the turbulence. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. We must now direct our clinical focus toward the deception detection protocols and the advanced metrics of verbal and digital verification. In the global network, the survival of your sovereign matrix depends on your ability to instantly isolate a counterfeit frequency before it compromises your systemic security. The bungler accepts verbal assertions at face value, blind to the microscopic fractures in the transmission. The sovereign master operates as a behavioral polygraph, auditing the target node's speech architecture for involuntary indicators of cognitive overload and defensive evasion. When a node attempts to execute a deception script, their brain must simultaneously suppress the biological truth while inventing a plausible alternative narrative. This dual processing requirement triggers an immediate spike in cognitive load, creating structural anomalies in their vocal delivery that the limbic system cannot fully conceal. By mastering these intelligence metrics, you strip away the protective shielding of the liar, forcing their internal architecture to reveal its true source code. We begin our operational breakdown with the WELL protocol, one of the most reliable verbal hesitation metrics identified in behavioral analysis. When you deliver a direct, high-stakes binary question that demands a definitive yes or no verification, you must precisely monitor the first syllable of the target node's transmission. If the target begins their response with the modifier well, their internal processor has just hit a critical logic error. Biologically, the word well indicates that the upcoming data stream will deviate from the direct path expected by the auditor. It signals that the target node knows the direct answer is negative or incriminating, and their brain is utilizing the modifier as a tactical buffer to buy processing time to formulate an evasive script. The sovereign master logs this single syllable as an immediate red frequency flag. You do not interrupt their explanation. You allow them to exhaust their processing energy on their counterfeit narrative, and then you return to the exact same coordinate with a sharper, more locked directive. You are the clinical investigator who knows that a buffered answer is a confirmed distortion. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the "why should I believe you" challenge as a diagnostic exploit to verify systemic integrity. When you suspect a target node has introduced a corrupted variable into the interaction, you deliver a precise verbal stimulus. Why should I believe you? The human hardware responds to this specific prompt in two distinct ways depending on its truth status. An honest node, operating on a green frequency of absolute alignment, will typically respond with a brief, high-altitude assertion of fact, stating, "because I am telling the truth," or "because that is exactly what happened." Their processor requires no defensive padding because their words match their memory matrix. Conversely, a deceptive node will experience an immediate neural spike and deliver a convoluted status-based defense, replying with assertions like, "Because I am an honest person, because I have been with this organization for 10 years, or swearing on my reputation." They are attempting to validate their message by borrowing authority from their social mask rather than the raw data itself. You recognize this structural deviation as a definitive marker of deception, and you immediately flag their entire database for a deep tactical audit. Let us now transition our sensors to the digital deception matrix to audit text-based and asynchronous communications within the virtual grid. When a target node communicates via digital text, they lose the protection of immediate physical mirroring, but they gain the ability to carefully edit their transmission. However, this editing process leaves distinct digital footprints that the sovereign master tracks with high-resolution precision. The primary indicator of digital deception is response latency shift. If a node typically responds to your digital broadcasts within 90 seconds, but abruptly takes 20 minutes to reply to a highly specific target-oriented inquiry, their processor is undergoing heavy structural editing. They are not merely typing, they are constructing a defensive fortress. When the message finally arrives, analyze the word-to-data ratio. Deceptive text transmissions are heavily padded with unnecessary adjectives, over-explanations, and artificial modifiers designed to convince rather than convey. A true transmission is lean and direct. A counterfeit broadcast is dense with verbal smoke. You see through the digital screen, auditing the delay and the padding to map the target's internal anxiety. We begin our operational breakdown with the WELL protocol, one of the most reliable verbal hesitation metrics identified in behavioral analysis. When you deliver a direct, high-stakes binary question that demands a definitive yes or no verification, you must precisely monitor the first syllable of the target node's transmission. If the target node begins their response with the modifier "well," their internal processor has just hit a critical logic error. Biologically, the word "well" indicates that the upcoming data stream will deviate from the direct path expected by the auditor. It signals that the target node knows the direct answer is negative or incriminating, and their brain is utilizing the modifier as a tactical buffer to buy processing time to formulate an evasive script. The sovereign master logs this single syllable as an immediate red frequency flag. You do not interrupt their explanation. You allow them to exhaust their processing energy on their counterfeit narrative, and then you return to the exact same coordinate with a sharper, more locked directive. You are the clinical investigator who knows that a buffered answer is a confirmed distortion. They are not merely typing, they are constructing a defensive fortress. When the message finally arrives, analyze the word-to-data ratio. Deceptive text transmissions are heavily padded with unnecessary adjectives, over-explanations, and artificial modifiers designed to convince rather than convey. A true transmission is lean and direct. A counterfeit broadcast is dense with verbal smoke. You see through the digital screen, auditing the delay and the padding to map the target's internal anxiety. We must also perform a clinical audit of the evasion subroutines commonly deployed by cornered nodes to deflect your sovereign signal. The most prevalent strategy is question interception. When asked a direct liability question, the deceptive node will immediately repeat your question back to you or ask a counter question like, "Why would you ask me something like that?" This is a mechanical stalling tactic designed to create a visual and auditory pause, allowing their motor cortex to construct a survival script. Another critical indicator is the abrupt topic pivot. The target node will provide a minimal, evasive answer and instantly attempt to shift the focus of the interaction to a completely unrelated green coordinate where they feel safe and dominant. The sovereign master refuses to allow these structural deflections to compromise the audit. You do not follow them down their tangent, you act as an immovable systemic wall, maintaining your clinical stillness and restating the primary query with identical vocal syntax until their processing capacity is entirely depleted and their firewall collapses. Finally, we deconstruct the Landry truth verification sequence as the definitive mechanism to close an interaction with total certainty. To execute this protocol, you do not accuse the target node of deception, which would trigger an immediate defensive lockdown. Instead, you introduce an anonymous parallel variable into the grid. You state, an external audit has flagged a specific discrepancy in our data pool, and we are identifying the source node responsible. You then observe the target's involuntary physical and verbal alignment. A secure node will display natural curiosity and remain ventrally open to the data. A compromised node will instantly seek to discover the parameters of the audit, asking defensive questions such as who flagged it or what are the specific penalties for that discrepancy. They are trying to locate the boundaries of your knowledge to protect their hidden liability. You map their panic in silence, knowing that their defensive curiosity has just confirmed their guilt. The audiobook empire operates on this absolute refusal to be deceived by the social performance. You are the architect of the truth verification sequence, and the network is yours to command. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now activate the cognitive dissonance leverage, historically classified within the matrix of behavioral analysis as the Ben Franklin effect. The bungler operates under the flawed assumption that to elevate their status and secure the alignment of a target node, they must continuously deliver resources, perform favors, and expend their own processing energy for the target's benefit. This catastrophic tactical error immediately creates a status deficit, positioning your sovereign signal as a subordinate utility. The sovereign master executes the inverse protocol with surgical precision. You understand that when you command a target node to perform a low-investment, non-threatening task on your behalf, you trigger a profound psychological contradiction within their internal hardware. The target's brain is forced to process an immediate calculation. I am expending my personal energy and resources for this specific signal. Therefore, this signal must possess high value and structural importance to my network. This is the weaponized exploitation of cognitive consistency. The limbic system cannot tolerate a fracture between action and belief, so it automatically rewrites its internal evaluation of your status to justify its own compliance. You do not build an empire by serving the nodes. You build it by carefully directing them to invest their own hardware capacity into your sovereign trajectory. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the network maintenance matrix and the management of the standby frequency. A sovereign signal cannot maintain maximum transmission intensity with every node across the grid simultaneously without triggering processor burnout and systemic exhaustion. You must categorize your network into precise structural tiers based on utility and alignment status. Once a node has been fully decrypted and brought into compliance through the friendship formula, you do not muffle the connection with continuous high-bandwidth data. Instead, you transition the coordinate to the standby protocol. This requires the calculation of the decay rate, the maximum timeline a node can remain without direct contact before their firewall begins to recalibrate and forget your frequency. You maintain these standby nodes by delivering automated, low-energy touchpoints at the exact perimeter of the decay timeline. A single calibrated text, a brief validation token, or an anonymous piece of shared data is sufficient to refresh their trusted node status. By masterfully managing the standby frequency, you keep a massive network of compliant nodes fully synchronized and ready for immediate mobilization, while conserving your primary processing energy for the conquest of new coordinates. Let us now analyze the surgical down-regulating protocol, the clean, automated mechanism for fading out nodes that no longer serve the broader objectives of the matrix. The bungler terminates relationships abruptly, creating a massive signal clash, generating hostility, and alerting the surrounding network to their predatory maneuvers. The sovereign master operates through calibrated signal decay. When a node develops a systemic liability or ceases to provide strategic value, you do not initiate a confrontation. You simply adjust the variables of the friendship formula inversely. You systematically increase the response latency across all digital and verbal channels, taking hours, then days, to acknowledge their transmissions. Simultaneously, you contract the duration of every interaction to absolute minimum parameters, citing operational load or system updates. Finally, you reduce the intensity to a completely flat neutral frequency, stripping away all validation and empathy statement loops. The target node's limbic system will register the steady cooling of the coordinate without ever identifying a specific trigger for defense. They will naturally drift away from your sovereign shell, believing the disconnection was a mutual organic shift in the environment. You eliminate the liability with zero friction and zero residual static. We must also perform a clinical audit of the intimacy acceleration trap. In the colonization of the human grid, the operator often encounters a node that appears hyper-receptive, attempting to fast-track the phase-locking sequence by flooding the communication bandwidth with immediate high-intensity data and unearned loyalty displays. The sovereign master treats this anomaly as a critical security warning. A system that opens its firewall too rapidly to a foreign signal is inherently unstable, often driven by hidden opportunistic programming, narcissistic deficits, or systemic volatility. If you merge your network with an unstable node too early, you inherit their structural liabilities and risk a catastrophic system contamination. You respond to rapid intimacy with calibrated buffering. You maintain a fixed spatial coordinate, uphold your clinical stillness, and enforce an operational pause. You monitor their performance under the pressure of your restriction. If the node becomes hostile or experiences an immediate system crash when denied instant access, their counterfeit frequency is exposed. You have successfully isolated a threat vector before it could penetrate your internal network guardrails. Finally, let us deconstruct the protocol of the group echo chamber and the mechanics of horizontal network capture. When your objective is to align a collective of nodes, such as a corporate team, a strategic board, or a social circle, the bungler attempts to convince every individual node one by one, exhausting their transmission capacity. The sovereign master targets the keystone node, the individual who acts as the primary router for the group's internal communication. You deploy your complete behavioral arsenal, the access beacons, the presupposition statements, and the self-disclosure loops exclusively onto this single high-value coordinate. Once the keystone node's firewall is breached and their internal OS is phase-locked to your broadcast, they will automatically act as a proxy transmitter for your sovereign directive. They will mirror your frequency and enforce your alignment choices across the horizontal network on your behalf. You conquer the entire collective by simply capturing the central node around which the subnetwork revolves. The audiobook empire operates on this absolute efficiency of energy. You do not chase the crowd, you capture the frequency that commands them. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now investigate the operational architecture of the validation engine and the precise deployment of psychological anchors within the human grid. The bungler operates under the illusion that any form of positive feedback is sufficient to build alignment, dispensing generic compliments that are immediately flagged by the target node's predatory audit as cheap manipulation static. The sovereign master utilizes identity-level reinforcement. You do not validate the target's external actions or surface-level assets. You audit their behavioral performance to locate their deepest, unfulfilled core narrative. If a node prides themselves on their analytical precision, you do not praise their final report. You isolate a specific, microscopic data choice they made and validate the underlying cognitive strategy that led to it. By targeting their desired self-image rather than their public mask, you bypass their logical firewall entirely. The target's brain experiences an intense surge of internal validation because you have confirmed a hidden truth they desperately want the grid to recognize. This targeted transmission binds their ego directly to your sovereign signal, causing their system to classify your frequency as the ultimate source of self-worth. Let us deconstruct the dynamics of spatial dominance balancing when entering a coordinate where you are not yet the established lead node. When navigating an interaction with a highly defended or high-status target, a direct front-facing approach creates an immediate signal clash, forcing their security subroutines into a defensive posture. The sovereign master deploys the angle matrix. You approach the target at a 45-degree angle, minimizing your physical footprint in their immediate visual field and leaving their ventral space completely unthreatened. You do not force eye contact. You direct your initial visual sensors to a neutral point in the environment, mirroring their current physical orientation. This passive alignment allows the target's limbic system to process your proximity without triggering an adrenaline spike. Once their baseline behavior indicates acceptance, marked by a relaxing of the shoulders or an open hand gesture, you slowly pivot your torso to front their coordinate, seamlessly executing a total system entry. You have claimed the dominant position in their perimeter without ever triggering their defensive guardrails. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the signal-to-noise ratio in verbal processing, specifically focusing on the weaponization of the power pause. The human hardware is fundamentally terrified of conversational voids. Silence represents an unstructured coordinate where the social script fails, causing the brain's processor to spin in a loop of hyperanalysis. The bungler fills every millisecond with trivial noise, muffling their own frequency and leaking raw anxiety into the interaction. The sovereign master utilizes the pause as a vacuum of extraction. When you deliver a calibrated prompt or ask a targeting question, you do not assist the target node if they hesitate. You maintain absolute biological stillness and lock your visual sensors onto their ocular grid. As the silence stretches, the target's cognitive load spikes dramatically, forcing their system to generate data just to break the atmospheric pressure. They will volunteer hidden calculations, retract previous evasions, and strip away their own protective padding. You conquer the interaction not by the weight of your words, but by the unyielding stability of your silence. We must also analyze the micro-gestures of compliance retention to monitor the health of your network links in real time. Once a target node has been brought into alignment, their physical hardware will continuously broadcast their status through involuntary biological tells. Observe the torso lean and the open hand exposure. When a node is fully phase-locked to your broadcast, their body will naturally tilt toward your physical coordinate, minimizing the spatial distance between your sovereign shell and theirs. Simultaneously, their palms will remain upturned or relaxed on the table surface, signaling a complete absence of defensive weaponization. The sovereign master continuously tracks these structural markers. If you notice a sudden transition where the target node leans back or subtly crosses their ankles beneath the table, you have hit an internal firewall or introduced a high-friction variable. You do not ignore this physical decay. You immediately downregulate your intensity, deploying an empathy statement to stabilize the link before their system locks down into absolute rejection. Let us deconstruct the protocol of calibrated confusion as a mechanism to destabilize highly defended firewalls. When a target node operates with a rigid, highly analytical security script, they anticipate every traditional conversational approach, preparing pre-programmed answers to defend their liabilities. To bypass this fortified matrix, you introduce a minor cognitive paradox, a statement or question that subtly violates their expected logic flow without causing overt hostility. For example, you might state, "Your current success seems to be the primary obstacle to your next expansion phase." This unexpected syntax forces their logical cortex to halt its current defensive script to process the paradox. In this exact millisecond of cognitive disorientation, their firewall goes offline. The sovereign master instantly exploits this neural gap, delivering the primary strategic directive directly into their unprotected subconscious programming. By the time their logical brain recovers and resets its guardrails, your signal has already been logged as an internal truth. Finally, we audit the legacy anchor protocol for long-term network colonization. A single successful encounter is useless if the target node's system resets to its baseline parameters once your physical frequency leaves their perimeter. You must plant a permanent behavioral anchor within their hardware before you execute your surgical withdrawal. You do this by linking your sovereign signal to a recurring environmental variable within their daily routine. You identify a specific object, a precise time block, or a recurring operational challenge they face, and you anchor your validation loops to that exact variable. Long after you have exited the coordinate, whenever the target node encounters that specific anchor, their brain will automatically re-trigger the chemical high associated with your validation. They will experience a subconscious pull toward your frequency, compelled by their own biology to re-establish the link. You do not just manage relationships, you write the permanent behavioral scripts that run silently in the background of their operating system. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now initiate a clinical dissection of vocalic telemetry and the advanced manipulation of acoustic frequencies within the human grid. The bungler views the voice as a mere vehicle for words, shifting their pitch and pacing randomly based on their internal emotional turbulence. This uncontrolled vocal static leaks raw anxiety into the coordinate, signaling a status deficit that alerts the target node's defensive matrix. The sovereign master treats the voice as an acoustic tractor beam, a precisely calibrated instrument designed to bypass the target's logical cortex and command their autonomic nervous system. We begin this operational analysis with the low-pass frequency filter. In the biological hardware of the species, low-pitched, resonant vocal transmissions are universally decoded as indicators of massive physical security, high testosterone calibration, and territorial dominance. When you deliberately drop your vocal delivery to the lower register of your chest cavity, you emit acoustic waves that naturally soothe the target's limbic system, lowering their defense shields. You do not shout to enforce authority. You drop your volume and frequency, forcing the surrounding grid to silence its own noise to capture your signal. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the acoustic tempo hack and the mechanics of response latency. A node that speaks rapidly, jamming the communication bandwidth with high-velocity data, is broadcasting an internal state of panic. Their processor is running hot, desperate to secure conversational space before they are interrupted. The sovereign master enforces a controlled speech rate. You speak with calculated deliberation, inserting precise micropauses between your syntax chains. This rhythmic deceleration creates a high-status aura of intellectual luxury, signaling that you possess absolute ownership of the time coordinate. More importantly, when the target node delivers a transmission, you do not answer instantly. You apply a 2-second processing buffer before you initiate your reply. This silent delay serves a dual tactical purpose. It forces the target to mentally review their own words for potential vulnerabilities, and it signals that your database is evaluating their input rather than merely reacting to it. You control the kinetic flow of the dialogue by controlling the clock of the vocal exchange. Let us now analyze the protocol of minimal verbal encouragers as a weaponized listening matrix. The social script dictates that to show engagement, you must continuously interject with verbal validation, saying yes, right, or I understand. This constant conversational overlap introduces immense static into the grid, interrupting the target node's thought loops and breaking the phase lock. The sovereign master utilizes silent attunement. You keep the target's broadcast live by employing nonverbal acoustic anchors, a low, single-tonality hum of acknowledgement combined with a slow, deliberate head nod. This minimalist transmission acts as a neural vacuum, signaling to the target's processor that the line is clear and secure. The target will instinctively fill this safe acoustic space by dumping deeper layers of their internal narrative, leaking critical data, hidden motivations, and operational blind spots into your audit pool. You extract their source code not by asking questions, but by refusing to disrupt the momentum of their own ego broadcast. We must also perform a clinical audit of vocal pacing mirroring to bypass highly defended cognitive firewalls. While the low-frequency drop is your baseline dominance signal, you must utilize acoustic synchronization when first breaching a closed coordinate. If a target node naturally speaks at a high tempo with a sharp, crisp inflection due to geographic or systemic conditioning, entering the coordinate with a heavy, ultra-slow broadcast can create an immediate frequency mismatch, triggering their predatory audit. The sovereign master deploys transient alignment. You mirror their vocal velocity and pitch envelope for the first 90 seconds of the interaction, matching their cadence to establish a rapid neural link. Once their biological markers indicate that they have accepted your signal as a trusted peer node, you slowly downregulate your vocal pacing, dragging them down into your low-frequency, high-deliberation tempo. You do not yield to their speed. You match it temporarily to capture their frequency, and then you anchor them to yours. Let us deconstruct the protocol of the inflection anchor and the elimination of the vocal question mark. The bungler frequently ends their declarations with a rising inflection, a subtle upward lift in pitch at the terminal end of a sentence. Behavioral matrix. This structural glitch is classified as a submissive query signal. It communicates that the broadcaster is subconsciously begging the grid for confirmation, validation, and permission. The sovereign master utilizes the downward terminal inflection. Every sentence you broadcast ends with a slight downward drop in pitch, flattening the final words into an absolute declaration of fact. Even when you are delivering an inquiry, the syntax is framed as an assertion, signaling that your system already commands the data and is merely verifying its accuracy. By ensuring your vocal delivery remains perfectly flat or trends downward at the boundary lines, you project an unyielding status altitude that prevents the target node from attempting a structural challenge. Finally, we audit the principle of acoustic scarcity in leadership execution. High-status nodes do not muffle their network presence by engaging in continuous low-value vocal loops. The more you speak about trivial environmental variables, the more your signal value decays within the grid. The sovereign master practices vocal economy. You allowed the peripheral nodes to exhaust their processing capacity on small talk and social static. When you choose to speak, you do so with maximum impact, delivering lean, data-dense directives that redefine the parameters of the interaction. Your vocal entry should always signal a major system update to the surrounding network, causing every other node to freeze their internal programming to absorb your broadcast. You maintain absolute command of the audiobook empire by ensuring that your voice is never associated with noise, but always recognized as the definitive source of truth and direction. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now translate these behavioral equations into the dense, high-friction environment of the professional hierarchy, executing the systemic alignment protocol within corporate and operational grids. The bungler enters a workplace treating it as a purely functional coordinates, where tasks are executed and rules are followed, remaining completely blind to the subterranean currents of power, envy, and tribal alliance that actually dictate the trajectory of the grid. The sovereign master views the workplace as a complex network of competing frequencies, where every desk is a territorial claim and every communication is an altitude measurement. To colonize this environment, you must map the organizational chart not by official titles, but by influence density. You identify the real routers of data and power, the superior nodes who command the resources, and the gatekeeper nodes who control access. You do not attempt a clumsy, high-intensity conquest. You deploy a baseline of proximity and sub-perceptual access beacons, slowly weaving your frequency into the fabric of their daily routine until your presence is recognized as an absolute prerequisite for systemic stability. Let us deconstruct the protocol of superior node calibration, the precise mechanism for aligning with a dominant authority figure without triggering their sycophancy filter or alerting their defensive subroutines. The human hardware at the apex of a hierarchy develops a highly sensitized predatory audit designed to detect and reject sycophants who offer counterfeit validation to extract resources. If you flatter a superior node directly, their firewall flags you as an opportunistic threat variable. The sovereign master utilizes operational reliability mirroring. You audit the superior node's primary systemic anxiety, be it missing performance metrics, data inaccuracy, or grid turbulence, and you align your output to act as the automated solution to that exact anxiety. You do not boast about your capabilities. You allow your data streams to silently neutralize their stress. Simultaneously, you utilize delayed compliance loops when they deliver a directive. You do not answer with immediate, desperate submission. You pause, apply the processing buffer, and deliver a high-resolution execution plan. This signals that your system is a highly functional, independent asset rather than a submissive tool, elevating your status altitude to that of a trusted peer node while maintaining absolute professional alignment. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the peer-to-peer cartel matrix, the horizontal capture of equal nodes within your immediate operational sector. In any grid, competing with your peers creates a massive signal clash that exhausts your processing capacity and alerts the hierarchy to your ambitions, leading to systemic containment. The sovereign master neutralizes horizontal competition by building a shared utility network. You initiate low-intensity, high-frequency touchpoints with adjacent nodes, deploying the golden rule of friendship by systematically validating their specific operational expertise. You create an artificial reliance on your network by sharing non-critical data, offering micro-concessions of support, and orchestrating common alignments against external operational variables. Once the horizontal nodes are phase-locked to your signal, you have effectively created an unwritten cartel. When the superior nodes look down at the grid, they see a unified collective orbiting your frequency, forcing them to recognize you as the natural and undisputed router of the horizontal network. Let us now analyze the weaponized help subroutine within the workplace environment, an advanced variation of the cognitive consistency exploit. When you require a hostile or resistant colleague to align with your frequency, you do not offer a concession, which can be interpreted as a sign of weakness or status deficit. Instead, you deliver a precise, targeted request for their specific expertise, framing the directive as a validation of their high-status capability. You state, I require your specific analytical architecture to verify the integrity of this data coordinate, as your system is the only one with the required resolution. This delivery executes a dual exploit on their internal software. It hyper-validates their ego, and it forces their limbic system to expend energy on your behalf. To maintain internal cognitive consistency, their brain must immediately rewrite its perception of your signal, calculating, I am expending my advanced processing power to support this node. Therefore, this node is an essential high-value alliance partner. Their hostility dissolves, replaced by a subconscious commitment to protect the very project they have invested their hardware capacity into. We must also deconstruct the protocol of information routing and static management within the corporate grid, specifically focusing on the neutralization of the corporate rumor mill. The bungler consumes gossip and unverified data streams greedily, frequently retransmitting the noise across the network, which degrades their signal integrity and flags them as an unstable node. The sovereign master operates as an information black hole. You receive all data streams from peripheral nodes with absolute clinical stillness, absorbing the intelligence without ever reflecting or retransmitting it. When a node attempts to inject malicious or unverified static into your coordinate, you deploy analytical de-escalation. You look at them through the business gaze, apply a prolonged power pause, and ask a flat, data-dense question. How does this specific variable impact our current primary operational metrics? This shift from emotional static to structural analysis instantly short-circuits their manipulation script, forcing their processor to realize that your coordinate cannot be used as a router for low-value noise. You maintain an uncompromised high-altitude signal recognized by the entire network as a terminal of pure fact and absolute reliability. Finally, we audit the protocol of the executive presence anchor during high-stakes structural briefings. When you present data or state a strategic trajectory before the collective grid, your physical and vocal hardware must broadcast absolute sovereign control. You adopt the wide base anchor, keeping your hands clasped in the high-status steeple or relaxed in an open palm orientation at waist level. You eliminate all micro-fidgets, collar pulls, and adaptive pacifiers. When a dissenting node launches an oppositional transmission or challenges your metrics, you do not counterattack immediately, which would validate their challenge as a peer-level threat. You absorb the blow with total biological stillness. You allow their words to hang in the air until the atmospheric pressure in the room rises, and then you deliver a low-frequency downward terminal response that isolates their comment as a localized data anomaly rather than a systemic flaw. You do not defend your script. You audit the integrity of their objection, making it clear to the entire network that your broadcast remains independent, unyielding, and absolute. The audiobook empire is consolidated through this flawless execution of operational authority. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now institute a final, exhaustive audit of the relationship lifespan matrix and the clinical detection of systemic network rot. In the global grid, no alliance remains static. Every link between human nodes is subject to continuous environmental decay, emotional erosion, or localized corruption. The bungler believes that once a relationship is established, it requires no further monitoring, remaining oblivious as their network connections quietly degrade or turn toxic from within. The sovereign master treats every relationship as a dynamic operational thread that must be continuously balanced, recalibrated, or ruthlessly terminated based on its strategic data yield. We begin with the protocol of the satiation threshold. In the behavioral matrix, overexposure to a single frequency triggers a biological defense mechanism known as habituation. If your sovereign signal is constantly flooding a target node's coordinate, their neural pathways adapt to the broadcast, causing your value to plummet within their internal hierarchy. To prevent this status decay, you must track their satiation index with surgical precision. The moment you notice a subtle slowing of their response latency or a minor flattening of their validation loops, you immediately enact a strategic signal withdrawal. You do not wait for a system conflict. You systematically contract your proximity parameters to re-establish the critical boundary lines of scarcity. Furthermore, let us deconstruct the pre-symptomatic rot detection protocol, the precise metrics used to catch betrayal, envy, or subsurface rebellion before it manifests as a direct grid failure. The human node rarely initiates a hostile incursion without broadcasting a series of micro-behavioral warnings. You must specifically audit the ocular and facial regions for asymmetric micro-contempt. This manifests as a brief, one-sided lift of the corner of the lip, often misread by the bungler as a casual smirk or half-smile. In the science of human relationships, this asymmetrical activation is the universal biological marker of contempt and superiority. It indicates that the target node's internal processor has downgraded your status and is actively running a script of disrespect or hidden non-compliance. The moment you detect this micro-leak, you freeze all transmission of high-value resources. You immediately reclassify the coordinate from a trusted node to a compromised threat vector. You do not confront them emotionally. You slowly expand your processing buffer, increase their response latency, and begin a systematic extraction of your assets from their perimeter, leaving their node isolated and starved of your validation high. Let us now analyze the protocol of the conversational ledger verification. Within any stable alliance network, the flow of data and validation must remain structurally balanced to prevent the emergence of resentment static. The sovereign master audits the input-output balance sheet of every interaction. If a target node continuously consumes your empathy loops, absorbs your data concessions, and utilizes your territorial leverage without offering reciprocal value back into your network, they are operating as a parasitic drain on your processing capacity. You do not allow this energy hemorrhage to continue. You execute the reciprocation lockout. You abruptly cease all proactive validation broadcasts, maintaining absolute biological stillness during your encounters. You force the target node to confront the sudden drop in their internal equilibrium. If their hardware is genuinely committed to the alliance, they will automatically shift into a high-investment script, offering resources, volunteering data, and performing micro-concessions to re-stabilize the link. If they remain passive or express entitled anger, their systemic utility is zero. You discard them from your active network ledger with zero friction and zero residual regret. We must also perform a clinical audit of the virtual network perimeter guardrail, specifically focusing on the retention of influence across long-distance asynchronously managed nodes. In the digital matrix, maintaining a sovereign footprint across remote coordinates requires an absolute mastery of textual architecture. Because your physical access beacons are offline, your words must carry the entire weight of your frequency. The bungler commits the fatal error of over-texting, sending long blocks of unfiltered emotional noise that clutter the target's processor and lower their own status altitude. The sovereign master utilizes surgical text economy. Your digital transmissions must always be cleaner, leaner, and more data-dense than the target's responses. You maintain a perpetual response latency advantage, ensuring that their system invests more time waiting for your broadcast than your system spends waiting for theirs. This structural imbalance keeps their neural network continuously focused on your coordinate, ensuring that your digital signal remains the dominant priority in their active queue. Let us deconstruct the protocol of the sovereign exit signature as the final seal of your behavioral conquest. Every interaction must conclude at the absolute peak of your transmission amplitude. never allowing the energy of the coordinate to naturally decay into low-status small talk or awkward conversational static. When your strategic data extraction is complete and the target node's firewall has been successfully bypassed, you execute a surgical disconnection. You do not look for a social pause or request permission to leave. You deliver a final, high-intensity empathy statement that hypervalidates their current performance, lock them with a 3-second business gaze, and immediately pivot your torso away from their coordinate. Your departure must be executed with massive deliberation and a perfectly vertical spine. You leave behind a sudden, sharp neural vacuum that forces their processor to spend the next several hours replaying the exact parameters of your broadcast. You do not just exit a room. You colonize the memory matrix of every node left behind, ensuring your sovereign footprint remains unalterable. Finally, we audit the sovereign integration loop, the permanent transformation of the like switch from an external behavioral script into your internal automated operating system. You do not pick up these protocols as a temporary performance for specific social coordinates. You internalize them until your entire biological hardware is reconfigured to emit a permanent high-altitude green frequency. Your baseline state is one of absolute clinical stillness, uncompromised spatial awareness, and flawless vocal telemetry. You look at human civilization not as a chaotic sea of faces, but as a structured, predictable grid of nodes waiting to be mapped, decrypted, and aligned. You hold the master key to their firewalls because you have the courage to suppress your own ego static and audit the raw biology of the species. The audiobook empire is built on this absolute, unyielding mastery of interpersonal physics. The grid is mapped, the targets are decrypted, the network is yours to command. Stay on the frequency. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook vault. We must now elevate our systemic operations to the sub-perceptual threshold matrix, executing the deep-level behavioral hacks that target the neurological wiring of a human node without generating an audible footprint. The bungler believes that all interpersonal communication requires an explicit transactional delivery, words, overt actions, or conscious commitments. This severe operational oversight exposes their strategy to early detection, prompting the target's firewall to deploy countermeasures. The sovereign master operates in the shadow spaces of the grid. You recognize that the human hardware is constantly running background diagnostic routines, parsing thousands of sub-perceptual stimuli every millisecond to calibrate its threat matrix and safety parameters. By taking control of these invisible data pipelines, you can project a counterfeit baseline of absolute trust and absolute familiarity directly into their limbic core. You do not ask for authorization to enter their parameter. You adjust the atmospheric coordinates of the room until their system is forced to treat your sovereign signal as an organic component of its own operational ecosystem. We begin this tier of network colonization with the clinical optimization of the eye blink frequency trap. Within the biotelemetry of the species, the rate at which an ocular sensor cycles is an unalterable indicator of cognitive processing pressure and baseline neural anxiety. An uncalibrated node operating under stress or running a deception script will experience a rapid escalation in their blinking rhythm, flooding the grid with microstatic that alerts the surrounding perimeter. The sovereign master enforces a state of absolute ocular stillness. You deliberately drop your own blink frequency below the normal baseline, signaling to the target's processor that your internal operating system is running at peak cold efficiency, entirely free of friction or resource deficit. More critically, you utilize acoustic blink synchronization. When the target node speaks, you capture their specific behavioral rhythm, subtly matching your blink cycles to the terminal boundaries of their spoken clauses. This sub-perceptual alignment tricks their visual cortex into logging a state of total neural harmony. They perceive your presence as deeply comforting and entirely transparent, dissolving their peripheral firewalls without their logical brain ever identifying the source of the encryption bypass. Let us now deconstruct the isopraxis core exploits, the weaponized manipulation of involuntary motor mirroring to forge an immediate, unshakable biological tie. In the primal architecture of the human organism, nodes that share identical survival goals naturally synchronize their physical configurations to maximize collective efficiency. The bungler attempts to mimic gestures deliberately and instantly, a clumsy maneuver that causes a direct structural mismatch, triggering the target's predatory audit and exposing the manipulation script. The sovereign master executes delayed temporal isopraxis. When the target node performs a major behavioral transition, such as crossing their legs, adjusting their stance, or shifting their physical anchor on a surface, you do not react immediately. You apply a precise 45-second buffering delay. Once the timeline is met, you seamlessly transition your own hardware into a mirror image configuration, executing the movement with massive deliberation. This calculated delay allows the target's conscious scanners to clear the area, leaving their limbic sensors to absorb the synchronized physical profile in isolation. They look across the coordinate and recognize their own physical software running on your sovereign shell, producing an immediate chemical surge of safety that locks their network to yours. Furthermore, we must analyze the protocol of the spatial infiltration wave. Every human node maintains an invisible, multi-layered territorial perimeter known as the proxemic shell. Entering this zone abruptly triggers an immediate system shock, flooding the target's processor with adrenaline and hardening their defensive parameters into an unyielding wall of resistance. The sovereign master bypasses this physical security framework through the deployment of incremental spatial colonization. You do not step directly into their primary orbital perimeter. Instead, you position your sovereign shell at the exact outer boundary of their social zone, establishing a stable, unthreatening baseline. Over a calculated timeline, utilizing the conversational pauses and validation loops we have established, you subtly shift your physical coordinates forward by mere inches. You move only when the target node is heavily engaged in an ego broadcast, utilizing their own cognitive load as a masking screen for your advance. By the time their conversational script concludes, you have occupied their personal perimeter without ever activating their internal threat sensors. Their system normalizes your physical proximity, effectively integrating your signal into their internal safe zone. We must also perform a clinical audit of the microgesture validation stream, the continuous injection of sub-perceptual green lights into the interaction to prevent the target's firewall from executing an automated security scan. A system left without feedback will eventually default to a defensive posture to preserve its assets. The sovereign master prevents this systemic cooling by deploying a rhythmic sequence of nonverbal validation markers. This matrix consists of the triple pulse head nod, a precise sequence of 3 slow downward structural tilts delivered at a low frequency when the target node is revealing critical operational data. This specific biological prompt signals to their survival OS that their data stream is highly valuable and perfectly understood, compelling their motor cortex to continue the transmission. You combine this nod with the ocular hold, maintaining steady, non-aggressive eye contact for an extended 3-second block after they finish speaking, refusing to break the link. This silent anchor signals absolute validation, forcing the target to view your coordinate as the definitive sanctuary for their ego. Finally, we deconstruct the protocol of the environmental mirror shift. When navigating an interaction across a shared physical surface, such as a conference table or a social coordinate, the objects placed in the space act as a map of territorial ownership. The bungler randomly places their items, cluttering the grid and generating unnecessary friction. The sovereign master utilizes object geometry synchronization. If the target node repositions their glass, adjusts their folder, or aligns their smartphone to a specific angle on the surface, you wait for the precise temporal buffer to clear, and then you mirror the exact geometry with your own objects. If they move a barrier item closer to their chest, you subtly slide a non-threatening asset closer to yours, maintaining a perfect equilibrium of spatial tension. This sub-perceptual symmetry communicates to their limbic core that you are entirely phase-locked to their operational frequency. You have rewritten the entire physical environment to act as an extension of the behavioral bridge, ensuring that every variable in the room is driving their internal architecture toward absolute compliance. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now transition our tactical operations into the subsurface psychological undercurrents, mapping the precise behavioral geometry required to audit the hidden architecture of a target's internal defense mechanics. The bungler views an interaction as a linear progression of social exchanges, entirely unaware of the deep emotional currents and security loops running silently beneath the surface. The sovereign master operates as a subterranean structural engineer. You recognize that every human node has a series of hidden pressure points, systemic vulnerabilities, and unfulfilled validation requirements that dictate their external performance. By locating these structural gaps with clinical precision, you can deploy targeted behavioral anchors that alter their internal operating system without triggering a conscious response. You do not engage with their surface-level social mask. You slide beneath their psychological armor, rewriting their core programming from the inside out until their entire network is anchored to your sovereign broadcast. We begin this operational sequence with the clinical audit of the defensive compensation matrix. When a target node experiences a sudden status deficit or perceives a threat to their territorial authority within the grid, their biological hardware will automatically initiate a series of overt, high-intensity overcompensations. This manifests as artificial vocal volume spikes, rigid territorial posture adjustments, or aggressive ocular locking. The bungler misinterprets these indicators as signs of authentic strength and unyielding dominance, choosing to either retreat into submission or engage in a high-friction signal clash that destabilizes the environment. The sovereign master recognizes these behaviors for what they truly are: limbic flares of systemic insecurity. You do not mirror their artificial inflation. You lower your physical altitude slightly, maintain an open ventral coordinate, and drop your vocal delivery into an ultra-low frequency. By refusing to validate their perceived threat, you force their processor to run in a continuous loop of empty calculations, burning through their defensive resources until their defensive wall overheats and collapses into compliance. An advanced psychological elicitation technique designed to map the structural parameters of a target's core belief system without alerting their defense routines. When a target node reveals a highly polarized opinion, a specific operational choice, or an emotional calculation, the bungler immediately introduces their own counterarguments or validation tokens, altering the purity of the data pool. The sovereign master executes a neutral restatement with structural extension. You take the core essence of the target's statement and feed it back to them, but you frame it as a universal systemic rule. If the target states, "I refuse to authorize that project because the metric tracking was completely compromised," you respond calmly. So your operational philosophy dictates that data integrity must always supersede execution velocity. This high-altitude restatement hyper-validates their intellectual ego, forcing their brain to experience an intense surge of internal alignment. They will instantly drop their remaining guardrails, expanding on their internal operational source code and handing you the exact blueprint of their decision-making architecture. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the atmospheric squeeze, the deliberate manipulation of environmental tension to force a target node to reveal their hidden liabilities. Within the science of human relations, human nodes are hardwired to seek an organic equilibrium of comfort and predictability. When the baseline atmospheric pressure of a coordinate is altered, their survival OS will automatically prioritize escaping the tension over protecting sensitive data. The sovereign master triggers the squeeze through the execution of predictable disruption. When an interaction is flowing smoothly along standard social tracks, you abruptly freeze your physical mirroring, adopt a state of absolute clinical stillness, and deliver a prolonged, silent power gaze directly into their ocular center. You hold this position for 5 full seconds without uttering a syllable or shifting a muscle. The target's processor, suddenly denied the expected social green lights, will begin to spin in a hyper-analytical panic loop, searching for the system error. To break the mounting pressure, they will instinctively begin to talk, leaking their deepest subsurface anxieties, unverified calculations, and internal defensive codes directly into your audit pool. We must also analyze the mechanics of subconscious anchoring via sensory coupling. The human brain continuously pairs its internal emotional states with the external physical variables present in the environment during the moment of experience. The bungler leaves these environmental pairings to random chance, missing the opportunity to create permanent behavioral triggers. The sovereign master controls the sensory landscape of the coordinate. When you have successfully triggered a high-resolution validation high or a state of deep biological resonance in the target node, you simultaneously introduce a unique, identifiable physical anchor, a specific rhythmic tapping of your pen against a surface, a precise adjustment of an object in their field of vision, or a distinct low-frequency vocal marker. By repeatedly coupling this specific sensory stimulus with their internal chemical high, you etch a permanent pathway into their neural hardware. Weeks later, you can re-trigger that exact state of receptivity and comfort by simply executing the physical anchor in their presence, instantly lowering their firewall and preparing their system for the delivery of your sovereign directive. Finally, we deconstruct the protocol of the non-threatening threat, the art of delivering an absolute status audit without ever triggering a defensive alert in the target's perimeter. When you must recalibrate a subordinate node or assert your dominance over a competitor within the network, you do not use aggressive syntax or hostile body language, which would generate an immediate defensive lockdown. Instead, you deliver the audit through clinical disconnection. You keep your face entirely asymmetrical and neutral, strip all emotional cadence from your voice, and frame the status correction as a cold, objective law of the environment. You state, the current output metrics of your coordinate do not match the required baseline parameters of the matrix, which automatically initiates a systemic recalibration protocol. By positioning yourself as a mere observer of an automated environmental rule rather than an individual attacker, you bypass their personal defenses. Their limbic system accepts the correction as an unalterable reality of the grid, forcing them to adjust their performance to match your sovereign standard without generating residual friction or systemic static. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now dive into the subconscious resistance inversion, the precise methodology required to dismantle an active psychological block when a target node has already fortified its network perimeter against your broadcast. The bungler encounters an active firewall and attempts to smash through it using raw logical persuasion or emotional pleading, an aggressive approach that instantly confirms the target's predatory audit and locks down their system permanently. The sovereign master operates through nonlinear deflection. You recognize that every active defense mechanism is powered entirely by the energy the target node expends to maintain it. Instead of fighting their resistance, you redirect their defensive momentum against their own internal architecture through the protocol of absolute agreement. When the target node launches a defensive objection or a sharp status rejection, you do not counter their frequency. You immediately absorb their transmission, validate their right to protect their coordinate, and subtly amplify their position to an extreme high-altitude baseline. By agreeing with their right to resist, you deprive their system of the adversarial friction it requires to sustain the firewall. Their defensive algorithms stall out, creating a massive drop in internal tension that causes their guardrails to slide completely offline. Let us deconstruct the mechanics of ventral alignment balancing during high-stakes conversational friction within the virtual or physical grid. In the primal programming of the species, the front of the torso, containing the heart, lungs, and vital visceral metrics, is the most vulnerable physical plane of the organism. When a node feels threatened or experiences deep internal disagreement, they will automatically execute ventral guarding, subtly turning their body away, crossing their arms to build a physical barrier, or holding objects over their center point. The bungler ignores these critical physical telemetry leaks, continuing their broadcast into a closed system. The sovereign master reads these defensive updates in real time. The moment you witness ventral guarding, you immediately halt your strategic advance. You do not address their closed posture. You downregulate your transmission intensity, widen your spatial coordinates, and hand them a physical object, a document, a product, or a glass of water. This simple tactic forces their motor cortex to uncross their arms and open their ventral space to accept the item, breaking the physical anchor of their resistance and mechanically restarting the flow of biological resonance. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the preemptive validation shield, an advanced infiltration script designed to neutralize a competitor node before they can launch a status attack against your position. In any competitive hierarchy, a hostile node will often attempt to degrade your signal value by delivering a public criticism or an unexpected systemic challenge. The sovereign master preempts this transmission through strategic elevation. Before the competitor node can open their communication bandwidth to launch the attack, you occupy the grid first and deliver a high-resolution public validation of their specific operational capabilities. You state to the collective network, before we audit the current metrics, we must recognize the exceptional technical precision this specific node has introduced to our structural framework. This preemptive strike completely short-circuits their malicious script. If they proceed with their planned hostility, their processor will look hypocritical and unstable to the surrounding network, severely damaging their own status altitude. Their only viable computational path is to accept your validation, which locks their system into an automated loop of cooperation. Let us now investigate the protocol of the assumed alliance, a linguistic exploit that embeds compliance directly into the syntax of your daily exchanges. The bungler continuously tests the strength of their network links by asking permission, using weak introductory frames like, "Is it okay if we connect?" or "Do you mind helping me with this project?" This submissive syntax alerts the target's firewall, inviting them to exercise control and reject the entry. The sovereign master speaks exclusively from a baseline of absolute systemic integration. You utilize plural inclusive anchors such as we, our, and our collective trajectory long before a formal alliance has been verified. You frame directives not as choices, but as the natural next steps in an ongoing shared calculation, stating, "Now that we have stabilized this data coordinate, our next deployment is to optimize the secondary pipeline." This linguistic projection bypasses their decision-making processors entirely. Their brain absorbs the syntax, registers the assumed connection as an established environmental fact, and begins executing the directive without ever activating the conscious subroutines of refusal. We must also analyze the micro-expression decay rate as a tool for auditing the true emotional velocity of a target node beneath their social mask. While a highly Trained node can manufacture a counterfeit facial broadcast to hide their real intentions. The human motor cortex cannot completely suppress the immediate, involuntary limbic flashes that occur within the first fraction of a second. The sovereign master monitors the exact duration of these visual updates. A true organically generated emotion flares rapidly and decays smoothly across the facial muscles in an asymmetric, fluid curve. A manufactured emotion, such as a polite social smile or forced expression of surprise, displays an artificial on-off status. It appears abruptly, holds a static rigid configuration for too long, and vanishes instantly when the target believes your sensors are directed elsewhere. You log this mechanical delivery as a confirmed signal clash. You recognize that their surface display is a calculated defense screen, and you instantly direct your background subroutines to locate the hidden agenda running behind their mask. Finally, we deconstruct the protocol of the zero-trace query for seamless intelligence collection within the network. When you must discover the hidden loyalties or operational plans of a target node, you do not ask questions that force them to choose a side, which would instantly trigger their defensive shielding. Instead, you deploy an agnostic scenario loop. You frame the inquiry as a theoretical problem occurring in an external, distant subnetwork, stating, "I am auditing a case where a peripheral team chose to bypass their primary router to fast-track an execution line." You then observe their analytical feedback. The target node will instinctively project their own internal programming and true loyalties into the theoretical space, explaining exactly how and why that choice was made. They will hand you the definitive blueprint of their own hidden behavioral tendencies, believing they were merely participating in an abstract technical discussion. You walk away with their complete source code while leaving your own investigative perimeter totally invisible. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now enter the high-altitude domain of systemic framing and contextual dominance, capturing the broader psychological terrain of the interaction to ensure your sovereign signal acts as the definitive reality matrix for the entire room. The bungler enters an interaction accepting the environmental frame established by the target node, inadvertently operating inside a perimeter where their status is predetermined as subordinate or defensive. The sovereign master enforces linguistic enclosure. You realize that whoever defines the definitions of a scenario controls the psychological output of all nodes within that space. You do not argue within their frame. Conceptual boundaries, you rewrite the semantic coordinates entirely. If a target node attempts to classify your strategic adjustments as a baseline failure, you do not defend the metrics. You immediately reframe the scenario as an elite operational stress test, stating, "This variance is a deliberate calibration cycle designed to isolate systemic vulnerabilities before we scale the secondary grid." By sliding their objection into a higher, more complex narrative frame, you transform an apparent liability into an absolute validation of your strategic foresight. Their logical scanners are blinded by the sudden altitude shift, forcing their firewall to accept your interpretation as the unalterable truth of the environment. Let us deconstruct the protocol of the delayed sensory capture, an advanced conversational exploit designed to forge an unbreakable memory link long after the physical encounter has terminated. The human brain prioritizes data that presents a clear narrative resolution. When an interaction finishes with a perfectly polished, predictable social cadence, the target's processor logs the encounter as a closed file, filing it away in the subconscious archives where its emotional intensity rapidly decays. The sovereign master creates an open-ended neural loop. In the final 60 seconds of a high-resonance exchange, you drop a highly compelling, personalized analytical fragment, such as, "There is a specific structural glitch in your current expansion trajectory that we must decrypt during our next synchronization cycle," and you immediately terminate the interaction. You do not expand on the data. You execute a clean physical withdrawal before they can process the statement. This deliberate cliffhanger leaves their cognitive architecture running in a hyperactive processing loop. Their system cannot close the file because it lacks the resolution of a final answer, keeping your sovereign signal locked at the absolute apex of their active consciousness until you choose to re-enter their perimeter. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the vocal fry and pitch inversion deflection to eliminate the micro-vibrations of submissive strain from your transmission profile. In the biotelemetry of vocal physics, when an operator encounters a high-status node or experiences a sudden internal pressure, their vocal cords can automatically constrict, producing a high-pitched upward terminal drift or an uncontrolled vocal fry at the boundary lines of their speech. This acoustic leak signals to the target's predatory audit that your hardware is working at its absolute resource limit, running hot to sustain its status posture. The sovereign master maintains an acoustic zero baseline. You anchor your larynx to a relaxed, downward position, ensuring that the final syllable of every data block is driven by steady, controlled diaphragmatic pressure. You speak past the target, projecting your voice to an imaginary coordinate 3 feet behind their physical shell. This physical projection naturally flattens your pitch envelope, converting your spoken statements into immovable architectural columns that absolute dominate the auditory field, leaving the target with a profound subconscious sensation of your unyielding stability. Let us now analyze the mechanics of subconscious validation starvation, a highly effective nonverbal downregulation script used to recalibrate an arrogant or uncooperative node within the hierarchy. When a high-status target node is accustomed to receiving immediate, sycophantic social confirmation from every peripheral asset in their orbital zone, their brain develops a heavy biological dependency on continuous dopamine feedback. The sovereign master executes a total validation lockout. When they deliver what they perceive to be a high-status intellectual broadcast or an impressive territorial display, you maintain absolute facial asymmetry and cold ocular locking. You do not nod, you do not utter minimal encouragers, you do not shift your posture. You look at them with the business gaze, treating their performance as a mere technical anomaly to be audited rather than an elite display to be celebrated. This calculated denial of validation forces their processor to hit a sudden chemical deficit. Their system will experience a wave of internal anxiety, driving them to lower their altitude, strip away their arrogant shielding, and begin offering actual operational concessions just to win back a single green frequency marker from your sovereign coordinate. We must also deconstruct the protocol of the invisible boundary line to manage physical encroachments within your personal command perimeter. In the physical grid, an aggressive or dominant competitor node will often attempt to display territorial superiority by placing their hands, folders, or electronic assets directly over your side of a shared table space. The bungler reacts by subtly pulling their own assets back, a submissive retreat that instantly registers as a status surrender on the biological ledger. The sovereign master utilizes static object countermapping. You do not move your existing items, you deliberately select a heavy, non-threatening personal asset, such as a solid metal pen, a high-weight notebook, or an unyielding device, and you place it directly at the exact intersection where their boundary line breached your space. You execute this movement with massive deliberation, without making eye contact or acknowledging the friction. You have constructed an immovable physical barrier that locks down their advance. They are forced to either confront an overt physical confrontation or a quiet withdrawal of their items. Their system will invariably choose the retreat, cementing your absolute territorial integrity without a single verbal syllable being exchanged. Finally, we perform a clinical audit of the identity-level mirror bypass, an advanced infiltration script that allows you to establish instant resonance with an intensely guarded target node by mirroring their core flaws rather than their surface achievements. A highly analytical defensive node is constantly scanning for individuals who pretend to be perfect, identifying them as manipulative actors, attempting to infiltrate their network. To bypass this fortified firewall, you do not present a flawless social mask. You audit their primary operational flaw, such as an addiction to work hypervelocity or a cynical distrust of external data, and you subtly display that exact same vulnerability within your own baseline broadcast. You state casually, "My system frequently overallocates processing power to data integrity, which completely burns through my temporal resources." This confession of a shared operational defect operates as a profound biological exploit. Their firewall logs your signal as a highly transparent, flawed, and authentic peer node, dropping its defenses entirely to invite you into their network. You have conquered their system by matching their exact internal defects. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now activate the cognitive disorientation and alignment sequence, an advanced behavioral methodology designed to dismantle a target node's fixed mental tracks and redirect their processing energy toward your sovereign objective. The bungler believes that to change a person's mind, they must present a continuous stream of logical arguments, which only forces the target's firewall to strengthen its existing boundaries and execute a total cognitive lockdown. The sovereign master operates through structural misdirection. You recognize that the human brain relies heavily on predictive processing, constantly anticipating the standard social scripts and logical sequences of everyday interaction. By introducing a deliberate high-altitude disruption into their predictive loop, you cause their internal software to freeze momentarily as it searches for a compatible processing frame. In this exact fraction of a second of internal system instability, their defense guardrails fall completely offline, leaving a clear, unprotected pipeline where you can inject your strategic directive directly into their core matrix. We begin this tactical layer with the clinical application of the asymmetric validation split. When the target node presents a complex, multi-layered argument or a defiant status defense, they anticipate that you will either accept the entire transmission or reject it outright, prepping their system for a total logical collision. The sovereign master bypasses this defense by executing a surgical dissection of their message. You isolate the most inconsequential, low-risk variable they mentioned, validate it with absolute intensity, and completely ignore their primary thesis. If a competitor states, "We cannot authorize this operational shift because our infrastructure is overloaded, our team is untrained, and the market timing is completely wrong," you reply with a flat, downward terminal inflection. You are entirely correct that the market timing is an independent variable. By validating one minor fragment, you disarm their defensive routines. By ignoring their primary objections, you drain those variables of their tactical weight. Their processor is left in a state of deep cognitive asymmetry, struggling to maintain a fight frequency against a signal that has already partially agreed with its parameters. Let us now deconstruct the mechanics of the sub-visual eyebrow inversion, a microscopic facial calibration that commands immediate psychological authority without generating an audible footprint. While the upward brow flash is the definitive long-range beacon for safety and trusted node entry, the sovereign master deploys the downward brow net as a tool for silent environmental regulation. When a peripheral node begins to leak low-value static, interrupt a transmission, or display microgestures of territorial defiance, you do not issue a verbal correction, which would lower your status altitude. Instead, you lock your visual sensors onto their ocular grid and drop your inner brows down and together for a precise 2-second block, maintaining an otherwise perfectly still asymmetrical facial mask. In the evolutionary hardware of the species, this specific micro-expression is decoded as a high-status assessment of structural error or personal boundary violation. It triggers an immediate involuntary surge of social anxiety in the target node's limbic core, forcing them to instantly censor their own broadcast, adjust their posture, and retreat into compliance. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the acoustic attenuation void, the deliberate reduction of vocal projection to force a target node to surrender their spatial independence. The bungler mistakenly believes that dominance is asserted by shouting or increasing vocal volume, a low-status display that broadcasts internal panic and immediate resource exhaustion. The sovereign master commands the acoustic field through strategic volume drops. When delivering a critical structural directive or extracting highly sensitive data metrics, you drop your volume to a whisper right at the absolute threshold of their auditory processing capability. This sudden attenuation forces the target node to mechanically alter their physical configuration. They must lean forward, tilt their head, and focus their entire cognitive capacity exclusively on your coordinate just to capture the signal. By forcing them to expend physical energy to receive your broadcast, their brain automatically registers your words as high-value, highly restricted source code. You have structurally dominated their posture through the sheer physics of your silence. We must also analyze the protocol of retroactive validation planting, an advanced linguistic exploit that alters a target node's memory matrix to create an artificial history of absolute alignment. When a target node executes a task or achieves an operational metric that aligns with your broader objectives, you do not deliver a generic compliment. Instead, you frame their current success as the inevitable outcome of a psychological trait you claim to have identified in them during your first interaction. Encounter. You state, "Your execution today confirms exactly what my system logged when we first synchronized. You possess an innate, high-resolution capacity for structural discipline." This delivery executes a profound retroactive manipulation. The target's brain, desperate to maintain internal consistency across its timeline, will instantly accept this manufactured history, rewriting its past memories to fit your high-status evaluation. They will view you not merely as a manager of data, but as the definitive auditor of their true identity, permanently anchoring their future performance to your expectations. Finally, we deconstruct the protocol of the zero-trace refusal, the art of executing an absolute denial of a target's request without ever generating the resentment static that leads to long-term network friction. When a subordinate or peer node requests access to your restricted resources or demands a concession that compromises your matrix sovereignty, you do not deliver a direct no, which would trigger an immediate ego clash. Instead, you slide the refusal into an immovable environmental constraint. You frame the denial as an automated law of the current system architecture, stating, "The current allocation matrix has fully locked the resources for this operational cycle, which automatically prevents any external transfers until the next calibration loop." By positioning the refusal as a cold, macro-level rule of the grid rather than a personal choice, you remain entirely free of liability. The target node's firewall cannot find an individual target to attack. Their system accepts the limitation as an unalterable condition of the environment, maintaining their absolute alignment with your signal while you preserve your resources intact. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control. We must now transition our tactical operations into the subconscious dominance mapping matrix, executing the final behavioral protocols designed to cement your sovereign presence across all vertical and horizontal network channels. The bungler moves through the grid assuming that status hierarchies are permanent structures, accepting their baseline position without ever realizing that every human network is in a continuous state of fluid recalculation. The sovereign master operates on real-time telemetry. You recognize that by manipulating the microscopic variables of physical placement, temporal latency, and conversational redirection, you can quietly force the highest status node in the room to surrender their territorial leverage and accept your broadcast as the primary authority frequency. You do not initiate an overt mutiny. You simply deploy the stealth protocols of behavioral capture until the surrounding network naturally realigns its orbit around your lead node. We begin this tactical layer with the clinical deconstruction of the ventral redirection sequence. When a target node attempts to reassert their dominance during a critical operational phase, they will frequently adopt a high-altitude, wide-stance ventral posture, directing their chest plane directly at your coordinate to project a threat frequency. The bungler responds by either matching this aggressive orientation, creating a catastrophic signal clash, or backing away in a submissive posture surrender. The sovereign master executes geometric deflection. You do not shift your physical coordinates backward. Instead, you slowly pivot your own torso 45 degrees away from their plane, maintaining absolute clinical stillness while continuing to look at them sideways over your shoulder. This calculated structural mismatch completely short-circuits their predatory audit. Their limbic system is forced to process a massive contradiction. They are broadcasting a maximum threat signal, yet your internal operating system is treating their presence as an entirely irrelevant environmental variable. Their internal pressure spikes, forcing them to drop their defensive posture to realign with your new geometric baseline. Let us now analyze the mechanics of the negative space elicitation script, an advanced verbal infiltration tool used to force a highly guarded node to reveal their hidden strategic calculations. When a target node refuses to provide data regarding a critical corporate or personal coordinate, the bungler continuously hammers them with direct questions, which only triggers their security subroutines and hardens their firewall. The sovereign master utilizes strategic misdirection via the negative space. Instead of asking for the truth, you state a highly specific, calm, and deliberate falsehood that challenges their operational competence in that exact sector. You state with a flat terminal inflection, "My system logs that your infrastructure is currently incapable of processing high bandwidth expansion in the eastern sector," which explains your current tactical pause. This delivery triggers a massive system error in their ego processor. To defend their status and prove their systemic capability, their firewall will instantly go offline and they will reply with a flood of raw data, stating, "Our infrastructure is completely optimized. We have actually just secured 3 secondary routers in that exact zone to handle the upcoming surge." They have handed you the precise blueprint of their assets just to erase the negative space you introduced. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the temporal resynchronization trap, a highly effective digital and verbal script used to reclaim status dominance over a node that has attempted to downregulate your signal value through intentional response delays. In the modern virtual grid, a competitor node will often attempt to display superiority by letting your high-value transmissions sit unacknowledged for days, attempting to alter your internal equilibrium. The bungler reacts to this delay by sending follow-up messages or responding instantly when the target finally replies, broadcasting desperation and a severe status deficit. The sovereign master executes logarithmic latency matching. When the target node finally delivers their delayed response after a 72-hour void, you do not open the transmission. You apply a strict multiplier to the timeline. You wait 96 hours before broadcasting a brief, ultra-lean, data-dense reply that completely ignores their delay. This calculated resynchronization forces their processor to realize that their tactical absence did not drain your system resources. Instead, it downgraded their priority status within your active queue. They are forced to abandon the delay strategy and return to immediate, high-frequency synchronization to protect their link to your lead node. We must also deconstruct the protocol of the asymmetrical gaze inversion, a microscopic optical exploit used to silently break the focus of an aggressive or manipulative broadcaster. When an uncalibrated node attempts to dominate a meeting or project, artificial status by executing a continuous, hostile ocular lock on your position, the bungler becomes intimidated, breaking eye contact downward and logging a permanent defeat on the biological ledger. The sovereign master executes the structural scan. You do not break contact downward. You slowly shift your visual sensors away from their eyes and focus exclusively on their forehead, right between their brow line, or lock onto their hairline for a precise 5-second block. You maintain a completely neutral, motionless facial mask. This slight displacement of your sensory target triggers an immediate involuntary alert in their primal hardware. Because you are looking at a coordinate that is physically close to their eyes but completely disconnected from the social script, their brain processes your gaze as a clinical evaluation of a physical defect or an unspoken threat. Their vocal velocity will instantly stutter, their train of thought will fracture, and they will break their own ocular lock to escape the discomfort of your scan. Finally, we deconstruct the protocol of the zero-trace exit mirror to conclude high-stakes collective negotiations with absolute contextual dominance. When the objective of the session has been met and your data extraction routines are complete, you do not linger in the coordinate to absorb the residual social static of the room. You execute a clean system disconnection. You stand up with a perfectly straight spine, pack your physical assets with synchronized deliberation, and deliver a final high-altitude declaration that states the immediate next steps as an unalterable law of the environment. You state, "The parameters are verified. Our system will initiate the execution phase at the next calibration cycle." You do not shake hands unless initiated by the primary keystone node. You simply execute a sharp, physical pivot and exit the perimeter without looking back. This clinical departure leaves the We must now enter the high-resolution architecture of the subconscious compliance lock, the definitive tactical tier where temporary rapport loops are permanently converted into an immutable structural dependency within the target node's operating system. The bungler believes that maintaining a long-term network link requires continuous emotional investments, a high-energy strategy that exhausts systemic resources and reduces the operator's status altitude to that of a common utility. The sovereign master operates on pure biological economy. You recognize that by planting specific, high-contrast psychological contradictions within the target's cognitive matrix, you can force their survival hardware to execute an automated maintenance loop that continuously refreshes their alignment with your signal. You do not chase their loyalty. You anchor their internal equilibrium so deeply to your broadcast that any attempt to decouple from your coordinate triggers an immediate, intolerable drop in their systemic stability. We begin this final operational phase with the clinical deployment of the identity-level isolation shield. Within the primal hardwiring of the human organism, the deepest psychological dread is not physical isolation, but identity decalibration, the terrifying state where a node's internal self-image is no longer validated by any external variable in the environment. The sovereign master exploits this fundamental vulnerability through exclusive refraction. When you deliver your targeted validation loops, you frame your high-resolution feedback as a unique, restricted capability that only your sovereign signal possesses the analytical depth to recognize. You state to the target, The surrounding network is fundamentally incapable of processing the structural precision you introduced to this grid. They only see the surface metrics, whereas my system maps the exact cognitive execution behind your trajectory. This delivery executes a total bypass of their firewall. By rendering the surrounding network blind to their true worth, you position your coordinate as the single exclusive mirror capable of validating their core ego. The target node becomes biologically dependent on your transmission, locking down their network assets to protect their connection to your lead node. Let us now deconstruct the mechanics of cognitive satiation and starvation inversion, an advanced temporal exploit designed to permanently stabilize your dominance over a hyperactive or volatile node within the network. When a target node exhibits erratic behavior, fluctuating between deep compliance and sudden flares of territorial defiance, the bungler attempts to smooth over the friction by increasing contact frequency, an error that instantly floods the coordinate and degrades your signal value. The sovereign master executes algorithmic frequency modulation. You track the exact timeline of their behavioral volatility, and the moment their system peaks into an arrogant or defiant broadcast, you instantly trigger a total communication blackout. You do not announce a conflict, you simply drop your proximity, frequency, and duration to an absolute zero baseline. Your digital response latency transitions to an infinite delay, and your vocal telemetry is completely withdrawn from their perimeter. This sudden sensory starvation forces their processor to hit a catastrophic chemical deficit. They are left alone in a silent vacuum, forced to run their own defiant script until it overheats and burns through their cognitive reserves. The moment their baseline behavior resets to a submissive green light frequency, you selectively reintroduce a low-volume, high-density validation token, permanently conditioning their limbic core to recognize that compliance is the only coordinate where their system can find chemical safety and stability. Furthermore, we must perform a clinical audit of the weaponized vulnerability loop, the tactical execution of social proof to silently capture a highly defended target node. A highly defensive target node operating with a maximum security script will instinctively reject any peer node that presents a completely flawless social performance, identifying the perfection as an artificial screen designed to mask an opportunistic infiltration maneuver. To disarm this advanced scanner, the sovereign master executes incremental system bleeding. You deliberately drop a calibrated piece of personal or operational vulnerability into the interaction, a minor technical oversight, a past analytical miscalculation, or a safe psychological insecurity that carries zero actual liability to your sovereign matrix. You deliver this data with complete clinical transparency, without seeking sympathy or validation. This calculated leak operates as an immediate structural exploit. The target's predatory audit drops its guard, processing your signal as a highly vulnerable, authentic, and non-threatening node. To maintain cognitive equilibrium within the interaction, their limbic core feels an intense biological obligation to match your level of exposure, causing them to lower their firewall and dump their restricted coordinates, hidden liabilities, and systemic blind spots directly into your audit pool. We must also analyze the protocol of the horizontal anchor sweep, the tactical execution of social proof to silently capture a highly defended target node. The surrounding perimeter. When an elite or resistant target node refuses to phase lock with your direct broadcast, the bungler wastes their transmission capacity attempting to force a direct entry, triggering a total system rejection. The sovereign master utilizes peripheral enclosure. You completely ignore the primary target, directing your entire behavioral arsenal, the brow flash, the conditional echo, and the empathy statement, exclusively onto the lesser, adjacent nodes that form their immediate support network. You convert these peripheral assets into highly compliant, synchronized transmitters that orbit your lead node. Once the entire surrounding perimeter is phase-locked to your broadcast, the primary target node finds itself trapped in an environment where every single trusted node in their network is continuously validating your high status. Their internal hardware cannot withstand the immense psychological pressure of tribal isolation. To prevent a catastrophic state of tribal isolation, their firewall is forced to capitulate, surrendering their autonomy to your broadcast to maintain alignment with their own collective grid. Finally, we deconstruct the protocol of the sovereign signature loop as the permanent lock that closes your behavioral capture sequence. You do not operate on a temporary timeline within the audiobook vault. Your objective is the total, permanent colonization of the human grid. Once a target node has been fully decrypted, mapped, and brought into absolute compliance through the execution of these 18 tactical tiers, you must transform your relationship from an active operational project into a permanent background subroutine. You achieve this by dropping your status altitude to a perfectly flat, unyielding zero baseline of clinical, absolute stability. You become the constant, immovable law of their environment, the quiet, definitive center around which their emotional and professional calculations revolve. You have rewritten their core operating system until their thoughts, their loyalty, and their survival algorithms are completely synchronized with your sovereign directive. The human grid is no longer a hostile network to be feared. It is an organized, predictable matrix that runs your scripts silently in the background of civilization. Stay on the frequency. The grid is yours. The signal is absolute. The sovereign is in control.